Find something you love to do and you'll never have to work a day in your life. It's a common quote. It was part of at least one of the graduation speeches I had to sit through during my school days. I think my high school one. Some attribute the saying to Confucius, but what he said is, "When the person in authority makes more beneficial to the people the things from which they naturally derive benefits, is not this being beneficent without great expenditure? When he chooses the labors which are proper, and makes them labor on them, who will repine?" This is in reference to a ruler assigning jobs to people, not people choosing their own work. The exact quote, "Find something you love to do and you'll never have to work a day in your life," can be traced back to Princeton University philosophy professor Arthur Sathmary in a 1982 issue of Princeton's alumni magazine. But in the quote, he attributed the saying to an anonymous old-timer. That's all irrelevant because the saying is not quite applicable today. Now, the saying should be, "Find something you love to do until the businessmen realize it costs money to pay you for it, and how dare you try to find a job you enjoy doing, you stupid git. Get back in your box and eat your trash and make us money." I've been thinking recently about the point of art. It's such a simple topic, you know? But the big AI bubble that has started in 2023 has sparked a few conversations about what it means to have all these attempts to automate art. There are, of course, good and bad ways to do such a thing. Various spell-check services are a form of automating meaningless busywork, and the more reliable these programs, the less the real writers would need to spend time double-checking to make sure Grammarly hasn't messed up their stylistic flourishes. My run-on sentence was a deliberate choice to show the narrator's spiraling mental state. Grammarly, it wasn't a mistake. Anyway, animators can use this technology to smooth out little imperfections, or maybe one day even fill in the bits between the lead animator's keyframes so that, oh right, that would devastate jobs in the industry and essentially eliminate the on-ramps currently in place for fresh talent. Whoops. But why does that matter anyway? If an algorithm can do all the grunt work, then every animator can be their own animation studio. Everybody who wants to make an animation can do the keyframes, and a computer can generate the rest to have a full feature-length product. Or hey, why even do the keyframes? If you can't draw but you have a good idea for something, you can generate the keyframes too. There, your story has been animated, and all you needed to do was be able to write a script. Oh, you don't know how to write a script? That's fine, there's an algorithm for that too. All you need is an idea for a story. Your dream story, everything you ever wanted to make or experience, available with a few taps on a keyboard, and whatever admission fee one of these programs has, be it in the form of money, data, or something else. The movie you've always wanted to see, the video game you've always wanted to play. Finally, Beyond Good and Evil 2 is done, and it's everything you specifically wanted it to be. The Star Wars sequel trilogy is undone, and so is the prequel trilogy. And Return of the Jedi too, while you're at it. Isn't this freeing? Why don't you show it to your friends? Oh, they don't like it. They disagree with the plot point you told the computer to include. They actually wanted Last Jedi to still be canon. They think the Ewoks are fun. They see relevant meaning in the Jabba's Palace prologue. They like Darth Maul. But that's okay, because a computer made them a Star Wars too. Your other friend did the same thing. Now there are a million different movies, all called Star Wars Episode 10. And none have any themes or subtlety because the computer program that wrote the dialogue doesn't know how to do that. I don't know how realistic the scenario I just described would ever be, but it's the logical extreme of the idea that anybody can use a quote-unquote AI to become their own production company, which is a thought some advocates for the technology have expressed. And it sounds miserable. What artist would want this? When I see something I've created reach its final state, I feel pride because of the process and my personal connection to it. Some things I would like to just snap my fingers and have exist suddenly, like cover letters for job applications or query letters to send books to agents and whatnot, but not the books themselves. What is the cost of the ability for every single person to algorithmically generate their own ideal movies, perfectly tailored to their tastes? Well, the on-ramp mechanisms for new talent in artistic fields would likely be eliminated. In some cases, entire fields of artistic production would evaporate. Who needs visual effects artists when you can type a command into a learning model that does the whole process itself? So then all the visual effects artists are out of work. Their years honing their talents wasted. Who needs concept artists when you can generate 1,000 options from a single prompt? In the worst-case scenario, every single creative profession ceases to become viable as a career, because corporations will never pay a professional to do great work if they can get good enough results for free. This means that the creation of art can only ever be a hobby after this point. People want to do what they're passionate about. So many artists already need to spend much of their lives grinding away at work they find no meaning in to fund their passions, with the hopes that one day they will be able to turn their passions into sustainable careers. The man who Elon Musk tried to fire before Musk realized this would have burned millions of dollars in a termination clause and disability discrimination lawsuit put it quite well. We used to fantasize about robots doing labor while we made art, but instead we made robots to do art while we do menial labor. And yet, so what? Let's say that the rise of these falsely called AI is paired directly with extensive universal basic income and full automation of the bad jobs nobody wants to do. So we're just living in the Wall-E chairs, making all the art we want to see, endlessly entertaining ourselves with our own ideas that are executed decently enough, let's say. This may sound hyperbolic, but this could be the complete death of culture. Art is a personal experience, but so often a communal one as well. To use the most basic mass-market examples, the experience of an event movie like Avengers Endgame relies upon community. Have you watched Spider-Man No Way Home by yourself? Isn't it weird when there are these long pauses they left for a theater audience to applaud when you're watching without a theater audience? And wasn't there discussion about how The Mandalorian's initial success came from its weekly release schedule fostering community discussions among fans, rather than being an isolated single binge experience? Even for art that isn't a theme park roller coaster event like these Disney franchises, community can add a lot. Maybe you were too confused to appreciate Toni Morrison's Beloved the first time you read it because it was imposed upon you in high school, but you hear someone else talk about something really interesting that they see in it and it makes you revisit it and enjoy it. Or perhaps you and your friends have completely different reactions to the Camille Monet on her deathbed painting and the two of you have a really fun conversation about it. So if everybody is only ever reading books or watching movies or playing games that they had an AI make for them because they just wanted to consume the same stuff they already knew they liked, if there is no common ground anymore, then what is left of culture? Food? Sports? Actual deep philosophical thoughts about life? Well, where does somebody get those thoughts from? All the philosophy texts are confirmation bias affirming AI books now. All the cooking recipes are the same, and that big touchdown was deep-faked. If a tree paints art in the forest and nobody's around to see it, is there any art? Emily Dickinson was a 19th century American poet. You've probably heard of her. She wrote a lot of poems, often known for their brevity and frequent discussions of death. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. Today, Dickinson is revered as one of the greatest poets ever, and if you've gone to school in America, you've definitely had to read at least one of her poems. Most likely that one. During her life, only 10 of her 1,800 poems were ever published, all of which without her name attached and possibly without her knowledge or consent. She spent her entire life holed up in her room, depressed, producing mountains upon mountains of writing that she thought nobody else would ever see. Oh my god, samesies. We read Dickinson today because her sister discovered her poems after her death, and her family and friends decided to spread them around. When she was alive, it seems she was writing mostly for her own gratification, creating her own art to express whatever she wanted to express to herself. Perhaps she wouldn't mind a world in which everybody made art only for themselves. Dickinson did enjoy the art of others, though. At her funeral, an Emily Bronte poem, No Coward Soul Is Mine, was read because it was one of Dickinson's favorites. She wrote favorably about Shakespeare, and it's believed she named her dog after a dog from Jane Eyre. In a world where people self-isolate into closed-off culture bubbles, perhaps that first generation, not born into it, would still be able to enjoy the creations of those they liked, but future generations may have nothing. No inspirations, no outside knowledge or influence. At least in the worst-case extreme hypothetical I've been discussing. But is there not some value in the purity of intention or lack of ambition in Emily Dickinson, who, it seems, didn't create for anyone but herself? Of course, many obscure artists are not satisfied with their obscurity. Vincent van Gogh did attempt to make a career out of painting and was faced with regular rejection. He too only achieved fame after he died. He painted because he was compelled to, but he did sell the art that he could, even in some instances where he did not want to. Perhaps one might assert that artists should not seek validation and fame, that such pursuits are unbecoming and cheapen their value. The word sellout is a common insult among fan groups of all kinds, and one of the easiest ways to destroy artistic innovation is to mindlessly chase trends or push towards mass-market homogeneity instead of being satisfied with modest success. But we don't need to live in extremes. The two options are not Emily Dickinson Pure Obscurity and MCU Phase 30. Artists having some measure of success tends to be good for them, actually. It boosts self-esteem, it can better energize artistic output to know that other people are enjoying what you're making. Even if you're just showing what you made to friends and family, like Emily Dickinson somewhat did, positive reinforcement from them can go a long way towards self-satisfaction. It feels good when you make a thing and people tell you that they like it. Who'd have guessed? In contrast, it can be demotivating to put hours and hours and days and months and years of work into a project only for it to be completely ignored. If a tree paints in the forest and nobody is around to see it, is there any art? Why would this hypothetical sentient tree bother doing it again if it feels like there's no point, because to the rest of the world, it might as well have never existed? I think about this a lot when I play relatively obscure video games. I play a lot of smaller indies, often discovered by accident from a random YouTuber who recommends it, or even the Steam Discovery page when I'm trying to get one of those useless sale cards to make into a useless sale badge. I've enjoyed my time with a good number of games that it seems nobody else has played. Games who have failed the most reliable, objective, and academically recognized measure of a work's popularity, the size of its presence on TVtropes.org. The character pages for the MCU are so exhaustively, unnecessarily comprehensive at this point. Almost every single Guardian of the Galaxy has their own entire page dedicated to them. Peter Quill's page alone dwarfs the entire character page of something like Masquerada, Song and Shadow. This is one of the games I found through Steam's Discovery Queue. It is an isometric action RPG published by Ysbryd Games, publishers of Valhalla and... It is a game brimming with passion. It has a beautiful fantasy Venice aesthetic that I feel like I rarely see. Its world features an Avatar-like elemental magic system and scheming guilds. It features an in-depth codex of its constructed world with the fun twist of being all from the perspective of the protagonist, Inspetore Cicero Gavar, which fleshes out both the world and our protagonist at the same time by giving us lore through his own opinions. It has a focused personal story with a small but tightly crafted party, and boasts some really heavy-hitting voice actors, surprisingly. It doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. When I played it, I just thought it was a cool indie game I found, but then I had to look up some minor tip or trick I couldn't quite figure out myself, and discovered how bare this game's impact was, even years after its release. The artists at Witching Hour Studios put so much effort into this creation, and now the game's website is gone. It has a few hundred good Steam reviews at least. That's more than many. That's the size of a rather large movie theater. On the one hand, that's great, and if we were to get all of those people in a room with the developers, then the artists would be overwhelmed with positivity. On the other hand, there are 8 billion people on the planet and counting. In a room as big as the Earth, a few hundred people cannot support your passion. The same year I played Masquerada, I played another game I had discovered the same way. It's called Echo. Developed by Ultra, this is sort of a puzzle stealth game where you have to face enemies who learn your moves and repeat them back at you. It takes place countless years in the future on a planet that has been hollowed out into one massive, opulent palace, if it ever was a natural planet to begin with. The shining, magnificent, empty halls and the dreamy music that make up this game's aesthetics have buried themselves directly into my mind, right in the spot obsessed with the inherent power of a place and the will of a location. It's the same part of me that fell in love with the game Control and the novel House of Leaves. Echo stars Rose Leslie, also known as Ygritte from Game of Thrones, as well as voice actor Nicholas Bolton, best known for playing Male Hawk in Dragon Age 2, and oh hey, he was also in Game of Thrones. This is not a perfect game, and its central gameplay conceit ends up being disappointingly limited when compared to its potential, but its ideas could grow with further iteration, and it has such a strong sense of identity and vision, as well as a clearly thought-out galactic setting we're only seeing a tiny but hauntingly gorgeous portion of. It even had movie rights purchased shortly after its release. Ultra had to shut down. For as rich as its world and character backstories may have been, I've only found one attempt at an analysis of it on YouTube. Admittedly, it kinda feels like this one video hit the nail on the head and not much more needs to be said, but I have been wrong about that kind of thing before. I've played a lot of small games with huge hearts and strong visions only to discover that it kinda feels like I'm the only one who's played them and found value in them. Masquerada, Echo, Sable, Solar Ash, Paradise Killer, Norco. Even games that did not grab me like Shadows Awakening still clearly had lots of artistic work put into their creation. Not all of the games I mentioned are equally obscure, of course. Some of them are quite well respected despite their small audiences. A healthy niche is perhaps the best thing a work of art can enjoy. If enough people like it and are passionate enough to keep it alive and evolving through discussion, appreciation, debate, and criticism, but it remains out of the sight of the exploitative vampires in suits who would drain it of its monetary value and leave it a puppet, that is best. If it can avoid what is most likely the inevitable fate of Disco Elysium and remain a jewel like Outer Wilds. But if it is too niche, then it simply is. An isolated experience for the lucky few who find it. There is something lovely about that, but also rather lonely. If a tree paints, you know the rest. I know what it's like to sculpt worlds from nothing and be met with silence. It can be disheartening. I've drafted maps, political faction relationship charts, cosmologies, histories, all to feed into a particular narrative with a theme I want to explore. I've done this on behalf of others' visions, subsumed my intention into theirs to the extent that theirs became mine, became ours. I've spent hours laboring over just the right words to say, just the right motivation for a character, or just the right analytical way to turn my thoughts and impressions into pointed arguments. And this is certainly ego talking, but I want people to notice and appreciate that. Humans are social creatures, after all. The great accomplishments of civilization are not built by hermits working alone in caves for their own gratification, but by cooperation. I'm sure there's some painter somewhere who knits their own canvas, distills their own paints, plucks donkey hairs to fashion into their own brushes, but 99.999999999% of the time, even the most solitary painters rely on the labor of others to create their tools, and they want to share their creations with others because they want to share their passionate souls. We stand on the shoulders of billions of other people, arms interlinked into the rough shape of giants, like ants who build bridges out of their bodies. And it simply feels good to be recognized for great efforts by the praise of those around you. It's positive reinforcement to keep doing what you're doing. That can be healthy, and it also can be egotistical. I know that my ambitions are driven in part by a desire for praise. I want to craft narratives that others will recognize and unpack. When I'm old, I want to sit in on college lectures covering the themes of my works. I want fans to be excited about my creations, to love them as I have loved the creations of others. I want my friends to tell me I did a good job. I want to leave part of my soul behind in the world to live on after I die so that I'm not completely forgotten by the time my grandchildren have passed. I don't want my life to be like Emily Dickinson's, creating so many unique and personal and meaningful works only to sit in isolation with them. And if we see this extreme case future I mentioned, a future where these so-called AI have obliterated creative industry and atomized culture so that everybody is living like an off-brand Emily Dickinson, then we have no community anymore, nobody to remember us when we go. Of course, I've realized even if we withstand this misuse of generative learning technology by the corporatocracy, perhaps it's still inevitable that my art will fade and be forgotten. After all, works like Echo are already so niche. Wouldn't this happen to everything with time? Isn't the idea that artists will live on through their art ultimately a lie? Quickly, name your favorite ancient Greek dramatist. I know you have one. It's Homer, right? Wrong, Homer was an oral poet and his works were not plays. Try again. There are few dramatists whose names have survived the passage of millennia. There's Sophocles, the writer of the Oedipus plays. If you're a purist, you might point to Aeschylus, known as the father of Greek tragedies. Perhaps you're a dirty commie who likes Euripides and the way he treated great heroes as ordinary people in extraordinary situations rather than being innately extraordinary themselves. These men have been remembered for generations, but a large part of that is circumstance. They are, apparently, the only 3 dramatists whose plays have survived the passage of time. How many other brilliant writers from the time have we never heard of who were immortalized in their work until, gradually, they weren't? How many other men wrote on the intricacies of the human condition in ways Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides barely touched, only for their insights to be lost? How many ancient Greek women were inspired to try their hand at storytelling only to have their genius squashed by time or misogyny or both? Billions of human beings with rich inner lives that they may have expressed and immortalized in writing, painting, dancing, music, and oral poetry have disappeared from the world forever because their preservation methods were imperfect, or because they were not of the noble class of great men who claimed to be the giants everyone else stood on. Or because their homes were invaded centuries after their deaths and the conquerors decided all traces of the old ways must be swept away. The internet will help with preservation, of course. With its limitless capacity for storage, there's no risk of a great library running out of shelf space. But the data is still stored somewhere physical. If a worldwide electromagnetic pulse fries every circuit on the planet, there's no way to get the online archives back. If human beings all roast to death in our own fumes, how long will our databases continue to operate? People love to examine scenarios where aliens examine the ruins of our civilization and find nothing but mountains of Onceler-on-Onceler fanfiction. But will even that survive? Nobody's carving it into stone, I hope. But let's assume a better scenario, that we continue to survive and prosper and preserve our art. Then our creations will have to face destruction of another sort, the destruction of changing culture. I imagine that few people today would want to seek out and read through the poetry of a medieval French peasant who felt, with all his heart, that he needed to pray the lesbian away from his 7th daughter or else she would go to hell. It may be a worthwhile historical artifact of how people felt back then, and also in modern Florida, but few would say it has continued artistic value. Art does not just age physically, but literarily, thematically, morally as well. Gone with the Wind is a classic American novel by Margaret Mitchell, adapted 3 years after its publication into one of the most groundbreaking films in history. It also has long been contentious for its treatment of the antebellum and Reconstruction eras of the American South, accused of conveying pro-Confederate lost cause ideas. There's a growing attitude that we don't need to venerate it any longer, that continuing to see it as an unimpeachable classic just because it was well regarded and popular when it first came out is unnecessary and reductive. I have never read the book or watched the film, so I can't fairly comment on the substance of these criticisms, but I don't have reason to think they come from nowhere. And speaking broadly, I don't think that we as a society have some moral need to continue to venerate a work of art made to express ideas that we have outgrown or maybe never should have had. Margaret Mitchell was far from the only artist to live after the American Civil War and hold a skewed perspective of the South. She was born after the official end of slavery into a wealthy Southern family filled with bitter ex-Confederates. There were many like her. There still are. I understand how, when Mitchell was brought on a tour of burned-down plantations at just 6 years old and fed stories of how awful Vernon Sherman's epic parade through the South was, she had a particular view imprinted onto the soul she would express with her art. She saw the ruins of the plantations but was not shown the monumentally greater devastation that allowed those plantations to be constructed in the first place. Indoctrination works best on the young. And in the early 1900s, the men, women, and closeted NBs of the South would all face that indoctrination to varying extents. When an artist bears their soul to the world with their art, they are also reflecting the culture they grew up in, whether they be in agreement or opposition to it. Culture is always moving, not necessarily forward, but always away from the old in some way or another. All art will see its relevancy and value fade with time. Some faster and more deservedly so than others. And what is the alternative, really? To force modern people to sit down with Birth of a Nation, the original one, and insist that they ignore obvious hateful biases and just appreciate the revolutionary cinematic techniques of the time? Ignoring historical significance, these techniques have all been surpassed by now anyway, by people not partly responsible for the KKK's revitalization. That's an obvious, uncontroversial example of something that deserves to be set aside. For other art, the question of where we draw the line is an important, difficult one. And I'm uncomfortable with the idea of tossing away all older media just because certain elements have not aged well. I love Star Wars, and Empire Strikes Back is one of my favorite movies. But Han's behavior towards Leia is a little iffy.
There's nowhere for me to run. What am I gonna do, say no?
Okay, that seems really dark.
No, it's not dark. You're misunderstanding me, bro.
I think I am.
Yeah, you are. Because if the girl said no, then the answer obviously is no.
No.
But the thing is she's not gonna say no. She would never say no because of the implication.
I wouldn't want Empire to be swept into the dustbin for that. It's just a part of the film that's been dated by evolving understandings of healthy relationships. And I don't think that there would or should be a concerted effort nowadays to cancel Empire Strikes Back for this. I just think that in 100 years, or maybe a few decades, or maybe even today, people watching the film for the first time will, in a completely mundane and passionless way, not enjoy the film because of these dated elements. Most instances of movies falling out of favor for aging poorly and having problematic elements are, more than anything, just instances of younger viewers being raised in a culture that doesn't share the exact same values as the old one, and thus they fail to connect with a film expressing those values. It's not some conspiracy or even necessarily increased oversensitivity, it's just time. Of course, in some cases, a very public fall from grace might spur on a critical reevaluation as a form of retribution. But such a thing only has impact if there really is bad stuff that slipped under the radar before. Such as if, to completely make up a hypothetical, a popular children's series uncritically copied the exact same rhetoric used by Confederates to justify owning slaves, and made it an objectively true fact of the world's magical slave elves. You know, just to make up an example. If someone becomes a successful writer, then one day in the far future, someone might discover their work and find it boring and unworthy of interest, even if it finds acclaim in the writer's lifetime, because of nothing more than value shift. No art is immune from this. What varies is simply the amount of time it takes for a cultural artifact to rot. We still value the poetry and complexity of Shakespeare today, but it's difficult to faithfully produce a play with a certain social perspective like Merchant of Venice or Taming of the Shrew, because it simply would not resonate with people. You'd need serious reinterpretations or pre-show caveats to even stand a chance. Even the best of Shakespeare's plays have survived the years as they have because scholars have been able to project readings onto the texts that better conform to updated values. And also because people make the effort to learn the vernacular of the time so that certain phrases or references are comprehensible. Not everyone is willing to put in the effort. In a sense, the continued appreciation of ancient works of art like Shakespeare, Beowulf, Chaucer, Homeric epics, and more is a result of institutional inertia, an inorganic societal effort to force us to remember these works deemed important long ago. It is a self-perpetuating cycle now where we are made to learn about Shakespeare and taught the necessary methods to fully appreciate him, or in a lot of cases, not actually taught these methods. And then we grow up to be artists and we reference him and continue to teach him because we were taught that he's worth perpetuating. It is, of course, completely possible, if not extremely likely, to think critically about Shakespeare's works and come to the conclusion that yes, he was a great writer and his plays are still worth preserving. Same goes for all the other classical artists. But his works would not enjoy the magnitude of perpetuation they do now without the many people who just accept his greatness as an unexamined fact of life. And so few artists are awarded this massive privilege. We don't have room to preserve everyone from Elizabethan theater, only a select few. It's a lie that artists live forever in their art. Whether by the destruction of physical record or the irrelevance of the values they created under, or usually both, history only has room for a percentage of the names of all the people who lived. If the human race survives another 200 years, then for the vast majority of that future population, the entire roster of today's Hollywood Walk of Fame will be reduced to perhaps 3 names in a single paragraph in a textbook on American history that they'll have to memorize for a test and then forget about. Well, I hope by then we've figured out better methods of education than cram and forget exam models, but you know what I mean. Hold on, didn't I start this by talking about AI? Realistically, I don't think this cultural apocalypse I've been rambling about will come to pass. People do want something real in their art, whether it be the knowledge that Tom Cruise is really about to die in every Mission Impossible stunt, or the knowledge that Barnett Newman was a real person who had a reason for painting a giant red square with stripes of blue and yellow. The disgusting attitude tech libertarians have about creativity is not a universal one. But what's really caused all these chaotic thoughts, what is genuinely a threat at time of writing, is the idea that technology and automation of creativity will make it impossible to dedicate one's life to their craft, to their love and vocation. If you've spent your life knowing that your purpose is to create, and you dedicate your time to learning your craft, then what can you do in a world that forces you to work to live and then deprives you of the chance to make your work something you want to live for? I recognize it may sound spoiled to be upset at the idea that people may not be able to make a living off art when throughout much of history, and still in the most vulnerable parts of the world, it has rarely been viable to do so. But the idea that people can has been an archetypal sign of utopia for a very long time. I don't want the thing I've spent my whole life knowing was my purpose to suddenly become outsourced to an algorithm that only knows how to give stories generic happy endings because it's programmed to always be positive and upbeat. I'm scared. So now I've made this an expression of my fear. It's art. Not necessarily my preferred medium, but it's good enough. I made it because I wanted to. I wanted to express what was in my heart, and I didn't want it to be filtered by writing a prompt to a robot and having it guess at what I'm feeling. Maybe people in my life would see it, find a thought that has been sparked, and share it with me, connect with me. Maybe no one will see it. One day, it will be gone. I've come to realize I don't care if my grandchildren don't pass down my art to my great-grandchildren because I likely won't know them. It wouldn't mean anything to them. I want to know I made a difference in the lives of those I care about while I'm alive. It's not like I'd be able to check in on if the impact has faded centuries after my death, so why should I care? If some alien researcher 1 million years from now watches this video, that would be cool, but I don't know them.
When I'm dead, just throw me in the trash.
Accepting that my art will one day join me in oblivion does not mean needing to accept the present-day destruction of art and culture at the hands of corporate greed automating the soul out of it. But I suppose I've taken you through this whole thought process I've had because the threat of quote-unquote AI has made me consider what exactly I find so worrying about it. All this talk of longevity, obscurity, and history is stuff that I've been thinking about, but the real fear is the one I said right at the start. I want to do what I love for a living, and I want to be able to share my thoughts and passions with others. Not just declare them or toss them out blindly, but share them. Art is community. Artists contribute to community, and that's not something that can be automated. I'm writing this at a time of intense anxiety among the artistic communities, because tech libertarians and businessmen who have passed the point where making good products is what improves their profits are doing their best to kill art.
We are canceling the show.
What?
Why? The algorithm felt it wasn't hitting the right taste clusters.
But they're the ones making their decisions by chasing trends, following the advice of algorithms, gambling with the livelihoods of others, and failing to have any real connection with the art they try to produce. They would have nothing without the community that good art creates, and their financial insight is far from unique.
Nobody knows anything, except the algorithm.
It's not the artists whom AI could easily replace.